The Vietnam War was a proxy war, which pitted the non-communist South Vietnamese against the communist North Vietnamese and their allies in the south of the country, which were known as the Viet Cong. This war, which took place during the Cold War era, also further separated the United States from the communist powers of the Soviet Union and China, as the United States supported the South Vietnamese, while the Soviet Union and China aided the North Vietnamese. The origins of the Vietnam War trace all the way back to the 1850s, when France first entered into Vietnam. The French went on to formalize their colonial rule over Vietnam in 1884 by creating the Treaty of Hue, which created the colony of French Indochina. Over the period of French rule in Vietnam, there were various uprisings against the French, but none of these were successful. French influence in Vietnam continued until World War II, when Japan took over rule of the country. This Japanese rule was met with great resistance in Vietnam, largely due to a famine in the country during 1944. As a result of this famine and the new Japanese rule, uprisings began to precipitate throughout the country. This culminated in the August Revolution, led by Ho Chi Minh. This revolution resulted in the defeat of the French and the creation of the Communist Viet Minh Party in northern Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh himself. After the establishment of the Viet Minh Party, negotiations over the future of Vietnam commenced in Geneva. These negotiations resulted in Vietnam being split into northern and southern countries across the 17th parallel, with the promise that in 1956, nationwide reunification elections would be held to unite the country. However, soon after the Accords, Ngo Dinh Diem, a fervent anti-communist, rose to power in the South. This would lead to conflict between the North and the South, and pretty much assure that the country would not unite peacefully, as planned. These events set the stage for the Vietnam War. In 1955, President Eisenhower pledged support to Diem and the South Vietnamese. Soon after this, Diem's government started persecuting suspected communist sympathizers who lived in southern Vietnam. These actions were met with retaliation from the North, and eventually culminating in full battles between the North and the South. This marked the beginning of the Vietnam War.
The Vietnam War followed the post-World War II conflict between the North Vietnamese and the French. The Viet Cong was a pro-communist group who disrupted the status quo in South Vietnam. The United States, along with South Korea, Australia, Thailand, New Zealand, Khmer Republic, and the Kingdom of Laos all fought on behalf of the South Vietnamese. They were also supported by the Philippines, Taiwan, Canada, West Germany, United Kingdom, Iran, and Spain. The communist forces consisted of North Vietnam, the Viet Cong, the Khmer Rouge, and Pathet Lao. They were supported by China, the Soviet Union, Cuba, North Korea, Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria.
I'm Joe Sommer, 78 years old, a retired Navy veteran. I had 20 years service in the Navy. There was definitely a growing resistance to Vietnam in that people felt, either they were very pro or they were very again. Well, being a professional military officer, I didn't have the privilege, if you will, of being again. On top of which, I honestly believed at that time that what we were doing was necessary and warranted.
The Vietnam War was not marked by any particular battle. Rather, it was marked by the constant insurgencies by Southerners in South Vietnam. Hanoi was particularly effective at causing and promoting many of the uprisings against the South Vietnamese government. As a result, the Viet Cong was formed. The North Vietnamese invaded Laos in 1959, and invasion routes were created through Laos and Cambodia by 1961. Up to 100,000 North Vietnamese troops crossed the border by 1965, and another 40,000 communist soldiers infiltrated the South. These soldiers were sent to stir up dissidents among the people, as well as to fight the South Vietnamese army and the Americans. The United States joined the war under Kennedy. While Lyndon B. Johnson increased the number of troops sent to fight, Kennedy still sent 16,000 American troops in by the time of his death. Lyndon B. Johnson became president after Kennedy, primarily focusing on his Great Society programs. However, when the USS Maddox fired upon torpedo boats allegedly stalking it in the Gulf of Tonkin, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was approved on the 7th of August, 1964. It allowed Johnson to escalate the war with essentially no financial restraint or limit on manpower. Johnson simply continued this progression of escalation and continued to send more and more troops to aid the South Vietnamese. The U.S. troops committed to the war were supposed to commit 3 phases to end the presence of Communists and North Vietnamese in South Vietnam. Phase 1 consisted of committing enough troops to halt the losing trend in Vietnam by the end of 1965. Phase 2 was a joint offensive with allied nations to destroy guerrilla and organized enemy forces. It would end when the enemy was forced on the defensive and they moved back from major populated areas. Phase 3 was an offensive intended on eliminating any remaining enemy resistance from any remaining North Vietnamese bases. This policy failed. The war continued on and the North Vietnamese managed to lure the Americans into the hinterlands at Doc To. As a result, the North Vietnamese launched the Tet Offensive aided by the Viet Cong, proving to many in the United States that the war was nowhere near finished. The Tet Offensive consisted of 85,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers assaulting over 100 cities in South Vietnam. While the U.S. responded effectively and eliminated the threat, it was clear the spine of the North Vietnamese was not broken or even bending. Following the Tet Offensive, public opinion about the war turned more and more negative.
When I got home in '68, the anti-warfare fever was even higher, obviously. I was so angry because all of these young kids that were either fleeing to Canada or carrying signs about, we won't go. I felt that the country had somehow lost its national direction and spirit. Fortunately, we all have 4.0 hindsight. I've done a lot of reading since then, and while I was still in active duty, I very much still believed in the cause. 20 years after that, after doing a lot of reading on both sides of the issue, I eventually came to the conclusion that, in point of fact, we never should have gone in there. It was a bad political decision on the part of JFK to send the first advisory group. However, once committed, then it's very hard to get out. And that's why I worry very, very much when I see what's going on in Iraq and what's going on in Afghanistan. We don't seem to have learned anything from that experience. And frankly, how they get with the all-volunteer force, because at least, at the time I was there, the draft was very much still in operation. And the people that I typically ran into were enlistees who were not necessarily gung-ho patriots to enlist, but they figured it was better to enlist for a specific MOS in a place like Saigon than to end up being drafted and, ended up as a grunt out in the rice paddies. As I say, I've changed my mind quite a bit in later years, and I think it really was a mistake for us to have been there. Now, whether anything would have come out differently, I rather doubt. I think probably the North would have succeeded in overrunning the South much sooner. But as far as the evolution of the country, yes, it's still a communist-dominated government. It is a communist government. But they have enough sense that they've emulated the Chinese, and they allow free enterprise and whatever. And it's rather interesting that now they look at Americans as pretty close friends after all we did to them. And it's war is not fun. And I had little direct peril to me, but just observed them from the position of lots and lots of reports and talking to people who were there. And I traveled some out in the field, not a lot, but a little bit while I was there in Vietnam. And, not a fun thing at all, but sometimes necessary, but you got to pick your fights.